Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our talk on voting during the pandemic, the benefits and challenges of voting in the time of COVID-19. My name is Sarah Cohen, and I'm a graduate student here at Caltech and a member of the Caltech Wise Social Activism Speaker Series. Our group aims to bring speakers to campus to talk about various local and global issues of interest to the Caltech community. This talk is also sponsored by the Caltech Management Association. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Professor Barry Burden. Dr. Burden is the Lyons Family Professor of Electoral Politics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Director of the Elections Research Center. He has written and edited several publications, including The Measure of American Elections, Personal Roots of Representation, and Why Americans Split Their Tickets, Campaigns, Competition, and Divided Government. Burden received his BA from Wittenberg University and his PhD from The Ohio State University. Go Bucks. He is also affiliated with the Lafayette School of Public Affairs, the Center for Demography of Health and Aging, the Tommy G. Thompson Center of Public Leadership, and the Election Administration Project. Thank you, Dr. Burden.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to the group for being willing to sign on to yet another Zoom call, this time to hear about voting during this very busy election year. So I do appreciate your being part of all this. Let's see if the sharing works. There we go. And it's probably appropriate that I'm the person presenting today because here I am in Madison, Wisconsin. And as you probably know, Wisconsin was the guinea pig for voting during a pandemic because our presidential primary was scheduled for April 7th. So just as the pandemic took hold, everything was shutting down in mid-March, Wisconsin decided, but through a variety of means, to hold its primary as scheduled, whereas other states were postponing or modifying their voting in pretty substantial ways. Wisconsin went through with it, and you may have seen the lines of people waiting, in some cases 2 to 3 hours in cities like Milwaukee to vote, and some of the stories about the difficulty with getting mail ballots out to voters and back to polling places. So we did learn a lot about what works and what doesn't work from that primary, and I'll try to say something about that. If you have questions over the course of the talk, please feel free to type them into the chat function over on the right-hand side of the screen for most of you. I probably won't get to the questions until the end, but I promise to work my way through them once the formal part of the presentation is over. So go ahead and log them there as we go along if you want, or save them to the end. And if you want to take the questions beyond the topic in the talk to talk about elections more broadly this year, be happy to do that as well. So let's get started. Voting during a pandemic. As you probably know, there's been a massive transformation this year in a very short period of time in the number of people voting by mail. What you see here is a graph of all the primaries, beginning with New Hampshire back in February, if you can remember that far back, through the primaries in early June, that show the rate of voting by mail 4 years ago during the 2016 presidential primaries, and then this year. If I did not tell you when the pandemic took hold, you could probably spot it right in mid-March as the blue dot, which is 2016, and the red dot, which is 2020, begin to pull apart. California, you'll see up there, is a little bit of an exception. Oh, we're skipping ahead. California is a little bit of an exception, but that's because of new election procedures that were in place in 2020 that really facilitated more voting by mail. But aside from California, until we get to mid-March with Michigan, Arizona, Florida, you don't see much difference in the rate at which people were using the mail as a method to vote until Wisconsin hits on April 7th. Wisconsin in previous elections never had more than 10% of ballots cast by mail. In April, about 65 to 70% of ballots were cast by mail. That, as you will see later in the talk, that is a massive transformation in a very short period of time. It was a wonderful and necessary option for voters who were unable to or afraid to go out, and at polling places where there were fewer poll workers and fewer polling places overall. It was a godsend. It was the only way the election could have gone forward. And you'll see that in states after Wisconsin, the pattern continued with just massive increases in voting by mail. So it is a wonderful thing, and it is gratifying to see members of both parties pushing their supporters to vote by mail, and lots of voters taking up that option where they can. But that's about where the good news ends. I'm going to spend the rest of this talk highlighting the concerns about elections in a pandemic generally, but about voting by mail in particular. So let's keep these rates in mind. They are necessary, and I think they will continue right through the general election when we expect maybe a majority of voters to cast votes by mail. But there are some real concerns that I think the average voter probably doesn't see that I want to make aware to you, some of which we can address before Election Day, and some of which unfortunately are just part of the process. So I think when most voters think about voting by mail, they imagine something like this. It's sort of a push button process for voters. They request an absentee ballot and it magically shows up in the mailbox sometime before Election Day. The voter leisurely works their way through the ballot at their kitchen table, and then when they're ready, they drop it back in the mail. It goes into some election office. In this case, it's in Utah, and the ballots are counted, and that's the end of it. People imagine it as a really simple process and as a convenience, For some voters, it is surely a convenience. For voters who have difficulty getting out, who are going to be away on Election Day, it may be more than a convenience. It may be the only way they can cast a ballot. But actually, for most of us, voting by mail is a bit of a hassle and is certainly more complicated than going to a neighborhood polling place on Election Day. So it is inconvenient, but the inconvenience may be worth it. And so there's both inconvenience and risk to think about, and I just want to spend some time highlighting those with you. So let me just give you a sense of what's happening behind the scenes when a person requests an absentee ballot. This is the major set of steps that have to happen in any voting process. There may be more depending on the state you're in. It may be slightly more or less complicated, but this is the general chain of events. It is not a simple process, and it's not merely a relationship between a voter and a local election office. Before any of this begins, of course, if you start on the left-hand side of this figure, a voter has to become registered. That has become more difficult during the pandemic as well. Voter registration rates in most states are down this year compared to where they were 4 years ago. And that's partly because canvassers and campaigns and others who do the voter registration drives tend not to be out, and voters tend not to be interacting with government agencies like DMVs where they would become registered. So we already have a bit of a bottleneck at the front end of the process where there are fewer people with current active voter registrations. Then a voter has to request the absentee ballot, at least in most states, and that ballot has to be produced by the election authority. There is a massive printing operation going on in every state to try to make all of the paper that's required to get out to voters. And this is not simply running off copies on a photocopier at Kinko's. This is a specialized printing job on special paper that meets the specifications of voting machines where it can be read. And each ballot has to be customized to the person receiving it. So it has to have the right offices on the ballot and candidates for the place where the person lives. It's actually a very challenging process, in addition to the sheer volume of paper that's being processed. Ballots get delivered in some way to voters. We're thinking about mail as the main mode for that this year. Voters take some time to mark the ballot and then return the ballot to the election authority. And again, I think a lot of us are thinking about that as happening by mail. But as we'll see, many voters who receive the ballot by mail actually prefer to take it in person for a variety of reasons. That ballot then has to be reviewed or authenticated in some way. And if it's defective, potentially returning it to the voter or contacting the voter to try to remedy or cure some of the imperfections. Once that is done, all of the ballots that have been received by the deadline have been cured or authenticated can then be tabulated. That process also is much more cumbersome in this election year because of the sheer volume of mail ballots, particularly in states that weren't designed to handle such large influxes. Their systems were designed for a small flow, and now suddenly large volumes are really stressing those systems. And then there's some reporting out of results, which we'll talk about as well. So all of this is happening behind the scenes, and all the voter is aware of in most cases is they made a request and something showed up in the mailbox, and that seems convenient, but it is taxing the system. And as you see here, it does require the voter to start the process much earlier than they would start if they were voting in person on a traditional election day. So it does require some forethought. So where do we get this system? Why is absentee voting not just on the rise during the pandemic, but why was voting by mail taking hold in the US before 2020? Let me give you just a brief historical lesson on where absentee voting comes from. It really does run contrary to a long history in the United States of people voting in person. In the early days of the Republic, that was often during a town meeting or some other local community or governing gathering, where people might also nominate or vote for candidates for office, often in person in a kind of rowdy, unregulated fashion. Beginning in the 1800s, there were some attempts to allow people to vote if they couldn't be present at those events. But it was typically war that made that happen. You'll see that during the Civil War was when the first initiatives began allowing soldiers who were away from home to cast ballots by mail. That didn't happen very successfully in the 1860s, but there was at least an attempt to allow that. Many of the states that allowed it during the war also rolled it back once the war was over. And that's a little bit of a pattern you see over time. As military conflicts happen, that tends to be an impetus for governments to try to facilitate voting from a distance, which is why it's called absentee voting. It's about, historically, the voter being absent from their polling place. It's not until the late 1800s into the early 1900s where the government takes over the voting process and begins issuing ballots and regulating voting in an orderly fashion. And so it's at that point that governments are really forced to think about who can vote not at a polling place or to do it by mail and how that would work. It's not until the 1980s that one state, your state of California, becomes the first one to allow a person to request an absentee ballot without an excuse. So suddenly voters don't have to be away from the polling place or don't have to be ill or have other obligations. They can request it without a reason. They don't have to justify the request. And it's not long after that that a spate of states begin to make the same reform. My state of Wisconsin adopts that rule 20 years later in, I think, 2001. Beginning in the 1990s, one thing you don't see on this figure is that states begin to experiment with all mail elections. In some parts of California, but in many parts of other states out west, like Oregon, counties or cities were allowed to have all mail elections where every registered voter was sent a ballot automatically, usually in a special election or primary, something like that. But it became a practice that voters became familiar with, got to like, it expanded. And so by the 1990s, you get the first state, Oregon, adopting an all, what they called a vote by mail system. It's really the distribution of ballots by mail to all registered voters. And there are now about half a dozen states with that kind of process. So that's the slow history of how this develops over time. And that contrasts pretty dramatically with what we've seen over the last 6 months, where voting by mail has taken off in just a matter of weeks rather than a matter of years or decades. And let me just show you how slow this trend has been. These are data from national surveys that the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects as part of actually its unemployment calculations. They do ask people in even numbered election years whether they voted and by what means they voted. These lines trace the answers to those questions over the last 30 years or so. There are really three methods that get captured here. One is voting on election day in person. That's the purple line at the top. The second is voting by mail or absentee, so mailing it in. And the third is people voting in person but early, often at an early voting center or maybe an elections office. What I think is amazing is that not that long ago, 20 years ago, in the year 2000, we were still seeing close to 9 out of 10 votes being cast in person on election day. And that really is a remnant of 200 years of American history where election day was the method that voters used overwhelmingly. And it was only a small number of places, mostly states in the West, places like California, Arizona, Oregon, and Washington, where mail voting began to take hold. But you can see that it's a slow evolution. And even by the time we get to 2016, about 6 out of 10 voters are still voting on election day. Only perhaps 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 is voting by mail. So although it may feel familiar and comfortable if you're in a place like California, for most Americans, the process has been traditional election day polling places, with voting by mail really being the dominant method only in a few states. So how are things looking today as we head into the 2020 election? What are the rules in place in the states? What we in my field would call the regimes that govern how elections are run. This is a recent picture you may have seen from the New York Times just this week, trying to capture for each state what the rules will be for this November. They are not necessarily the rules that were in place 4 years ago, or will even be in place for elections next year or the year after. In some cases, these are temporary provisions that are being made just for this election. And let's take a look at the 3 types. On the far left at the top, you'll see that about 20% of voters live in states with automatic distribution of ballots to all registered voters by mail. Before this election, it was about 5 states that did that: Oregon, Washington, Utah, Nevada, Colorado. We now have other states jumping on board. California is the big one just for this year, District of Columbia, Hawaii, and so on. So there are a lot of voters who live in places where the ballot's just going to arrive as long as their registration is current. But you can see that those dark green states are predominantly in the far western part of the country and really don't represent the standard practice for most voters. The most common approach is the one in the middle, these light blue states, where a person can request an absentee ballot without an excuse. So you simply request it as long as you're registered and have the ID or whatever else might be needed. More than half of voters live in states like that. That covers most of the Mountain West, most of the Midwest, and some of the South, and increasingly parts of New England that had been very traditional. But there's still about a quarter of the public who live in states where absentee voting is not available unless a person has an approved excuse. Those excuses are typically enumerated on the application and include things like illness, being away from the polls, or some other obligation like work or family caregiving. And in some states, that excuse actually has to be notarized by a second person or witnessed by another individual. So it can be very challenging. Several of these states, including Texas, have clarified that fear of getting the coronavirus is not an acceptable reason to request an absentee ballot. It really needs to be one of the few enumerated reasons that are provided on the ballot application. So as you can imagine, this is not necessarily a popular position, and there are lawsuits underway in Texas and elsewhere to try to change those rules. But it looks, now that we're about 3 months from Election Day, that this set of states, most of which are sort of concentrated in the South, plus New York, are going to stick with the rules. And you'll see very little absentee voting there, maybe in the single digits or low teens. So these are the rules headed into 2020. Let's look at how much voting by mail actually happens. So here I've produced a figure based on the 2016 election that comes from data collected by the Election Assistance Commission. That's a federal agency, which is the closest thing the United States has to a national election office. They conduct a survey every 2 years, asking states to report a variety of data. One of them is what share of all the ballots cast were distributed by or returned by mail. And this is the figure. I'll just say now there is some wonkiness in the data here. I wouldn't believe all of this, and I'll just point to 2 states that are problematic. One is Oregon, which is right here at the top. They're the premier vote by mail state. They certainly distribute all of their ballots by mail, but they don't receive all of them by mail back. They actually receive a minority of the ballots back by mail, and that's true in most vote by mail states. Before the pandemic, voters who receive their ballot by mail predominantly return the ballot in person. They like to drive it in, take it to a polling place on election day, or in Oregon and other states, leave it in a drop box. So this is a little bit of a misreporting on Oregon's part. It's also a misreporting on Washington's part. Washington is down here on the left. They're reporting 0 ballots by mail. In fact, all of their ballots are distributed by mail, and a good chunk of them come back by mail. So set aside a couple of those oddities in how states are reporting. And you can see that the states that have high levels of return by mail tend to be out west, your Arizona, Montana, California, Hawaii, and so on. But they are really the outliers. The national average was about 25%. So right here, and the vast majority of states are below that. In fact, most states have, before this year, have less than 10% of their ballots returned by mail. So it really is exceptional to see the massive rates voting by mail this year. So these are the ballots that come back. The question I think that's going to confront us this November is what share of those ballots will actually be counted. I'm going to try to share with you just the variety of ways in which the voting by mail process can go wrong, resulting in a ballot not being counted for a variety of reasons. So here from the same data set from the EAC is the percentage of all the ballots that come in by mail that are rejected. They are not counted for a variety of reasons. The national average was right around 2%. So about 1 out of 50 mail ballots was not counted in 2016. To me, that's a risk. A 2% chance of my vote not being counted sounds like a serious risk. Maybe it's worth it if you balance that against other risks, in particular of being exposed to the coronavirus this year, or if it's your only option because you're unable to go to the polls on election day or to an early voting location or some other option. But there is a fair amount of ballot rejection, but it does vary across the states. There are a few states here in the upper right-hand side of the figure, sort of concentrated in the South with much higher levels of rejection. In some cases, it's over 5%. So about 1 out of every 20 ballots that are mailed in is not counted. But there are also states down in the lower left-hand part of the graph who reject almost none of the ballots. Now, if you remember the ordering of states in the previous graph, and then look at the ordering of states here, they are almost in opposite order, meaning that the states that distribute most ballots by mail and receive them back by mail also reject the smallest share of them. The states that lean most heavily on the mail as a method of voting are also most accommodating of those ballots when they come back and are less likely to reject them. And states that use less voting by mail, places like Arkansas, Georgia, and New York, tend to be pretty strict and reject a lot of those ballots that come back in. So if there is good news in any of this, it's that when states reach a kind of critical threshold that they are relying very heavily on voting by mail, they also really improve those systems so that voters are not making mistakes, so that they're working well with the Postal Service, and so that election officials are receiving the ballots and have good, systematic, thorough, and accommodating ways to validate those ballots so they aren't rejected unnecessarily. But I do think this is something to keep in mind. This is something that does not happen for voters who vote in person. Think about the difference in how a voter at a polling place interacts with the rest of the election infrastructure versus someone who votes by mail. A voter who votes in person is there in the presence of poll workers in a public place, casting a ballot. If there's any problem at all, confusion about the ballot, a mistake that the voter makes in marking the ballot, a problem with the tabulating machine, it can be fixed on the spot with the cooperation of the voter and a poll worker. So there are almost no ballots that get rejected among those people who vote at polling places. But voting by mail separates the voter from their ballot. It's dropped into the mail stream. It's then subject to the Postal Service carrying it back, it being delivered on time, poll workers handling it appropriately, and the machines counting it appropriately. If a voter has made a mistake on the ballot, for example, by voting twice for president when they should only be voting for one candidate, that ballot will be rejected if it's mailed in, maybe without the voter even knowing it. If the voter makes that mistake at a polling place, the poll worker can replace the spoiled ballot with a new ballot, and it's remedied on the spot. So this voting by mail system really has been a lifesaver, particularly this election year. It's necessary for many voters, but it does come with a substantially higher risk of the ballot not being counted. So what are the reasons why ballots don't get counted? Well, here's data from the same national survey. This is information collected from all the states, asking them why, when a ballot was rejected, What was the reason for that? It does vary a lot across the states depending on their rules, but you can see that there are a few key reasons here in the upper right-hand side of the table that really dominate. The most common reasons for rejecting a ballot is that there was the signature on the ballot envelope did not match the signature that was on record, that the ballot did not arrive on time. Either it wasn't postmarked on time, if you're a so-called postmark state, or it didn't arrive by a deadline, if you're a deadline state, or the voter didn't sign the absentee ballot envelope. That's about 1 in 5 cases. Now let's think about the signature issue for a moment. Non-matching signatures. Some states like California match the signature on the envelope to one that they have on record. California has a very thorough, extensive system, as you probably know. It takes California weeks in some cases to finalize an election, in part because they are validating signatures. There's a real risk if a state does not have that extensive process that a signature can be rejected falsely because the one on record doesn't resemble the one that's on the ballot. But we know that people's signatures evolve over time, over their lifespan. And so the signature you may have at age 40 when voting may be different than the one that's on file from 10 or 20 years ago when you first registered to vote, or when you got a driver's license or had some other interaction with the state and put a signature on file. We also know that people's signatures evolve for other reasons. In older age, a signature can become maybe lighter or sketchier, less smooth. It becomes hard to validate. It turns out that younger people and older people are particularly at risk for either not having a signature on file at all, or having multiple signatures that seem not to be in alignment, or a signature that's simply hard to validate. And with young people now being less likely to learn cursive writing in school, the development of a signature is not as natural or universal as it once was. So the matching of signatures has become challenging, and there are some really cool high-tech methods that are used. Electronic scan of signatures is done as a first cut in states like Colorado, but it's very time-consuming if states are going to do it, and a lot of ballots get rejected because the signatures are unable to be matched. The other two reasons there, missing the deadline and missing a signature, are simply errors that either the voter makes or are caused by the Postal Service not returning the ballot in at least the time that the voter expected. So I think there are some things that can be done there, but these are always risks. When someone drops a ballot into the mail, one of these things could happen. And again, depending on the state in which you live and the time when this is done, the voter may or may not even be aware that their ballot has been rejected because of lateness, because of a missing signature, or because of a non-matching signature. And if they do become aware, it may be too late to do much about it, if anything. Okay, so this is the overall picture from 2016, and it's similar to what we've seen out of the primaries this year in terms of the rate of rejection and the reasons for rejection. I think if you link these statistics up with the earlier chain of events that I showed at the beginning of the talk, you will see that the voting by mail system is a kind of pipeline that has a lot of potential leaks along the way. There are just many places where a ballot can be pushed aside, not counted, or not transmitted because of failure of the election official, the Postal Service, or the voter. So just how much of that is happening, and in what kinds of places is it happening? Well, let's have a look at it through, this is a table from a recent report by my co-author Charles Stewart that looks at the reasons and rates for which mail ballots were not counted in the 2016 presidential election. As I showed you earlier, the overall rejection rate of mail ballots was about 2%. So about 1 out of every 50 ballots was rejected. But it's actually a higher number than that are not counted for a broader set of reasons, including that the voter never received the ballot that they requested in the first place. If we add together those things that happen on the front end, plus the problems where a voter's ballot is not counted, but it has been returned, the national rate of not counting is about 4%, so about twice as high. So now it's about 1 out of every 25 voters who attempts to vote by mail whose ballot is not counted. If it's, again, both the rejection rate for those who get the ballot in and for those who never received the ballot or had some problem in the earlier transmission. So along the left-hand side of this table are a variety of reasons why votes might be lost in the mail system. from the earliest part of the process to later in the process. It begins in cases where a voter requests an absentee ballot, but the election office is unaware that that request was ever made. Maybe the voter requested the absentee ballot by a mail form and the form never arrived or it was lost. Maybe they requested it through an electronic portal. This happened a lot in Wisconsin back in March and April, but for some reason that request was never transmitted to the local official. So in those cases, the voter may believe that they've made a request and also believe or hope that it's been received, but there are cases you can see that's a non-zero number of ballot requests that election officials say they never received. There are also ballot requests that are unfulfilled, ones that are received by the election office but never result in a ballot being sent out. Some of those happened again in the Wisconsin primary because election officials were so overwhelmed by the volume of requests that they were apt to make mistakes, sometimes skipping over requests as they work through the list, or sometimes misplacing requests or other kinds of clerical errors. Third in the list are ballots that have been requested and issued, but for whatever reason, the voter didn't receive it. This is a relatively high rate. It's about 0.7% across these four kinds of mail ballot regimes. This may be a problem of the Postal Service, misdelivering the mail. There are cases of the Postal Service not delivering at all, returning it to the office that sent it out. Or it may be intercepted by someone else. Maybe someone else in the household where it's been delivered grabs the ballot and the voter never sees it. Or maybe stolen out of a mailbox by someone else or misdelivered to a different mailbox. So there are a whole variety of ways in which the mail system can go wrong. Once a ballot is received by the voter and marked by the voter, it should be returned. But you'll see there, the fourth item on the list are ballots that are never returned, and at least never received by the election office when the voter thinks they were returned. Again, this could be a Postal Service problem that the voter has put the ballot into the mail stream, but it, for whatever reason, doesn't show up at the election official's office. Maybe they think that the voter has dropped off the ballot in some way, but it just hasn't gotten there for unclear reasons. Then we have the ballots that we've already talked about at the bottom, a ballot that's rejected by an election office, typically for a signature problem or lateness. And then finally, ballots where a voter mailed in the ballot, it was received, it was not rejected, but the voter actually didn't mark a candidate preference in the top race on the ballot. It seems very unlikely that someone would submit a ballot this November and not choose a candidate for president. They might well skip races further down the ballot about which they have less information or maybe care less. But we do see ballots that come in by mail that have blank races at a much higher rate than votes that are cast in person. So those seem to be errors. So if you add up these 6 or 7 reasons for votes being lost in the mail process, you'll see that on average it's about 4% of ballots that are not counted successfully. But it does vary depending on the kind of regime in which a person lives. So in states like Texas, where an excuse is required to vote by absentee, the rate is about 5%. So about 1 out of every 20 mail ballots not counted, that's lost somewhere along the way. But the rates tend to improve as you go to states that rely more and more heavily on voting by mail. By the time you get to Oregon, Washington, Colorado, the so-called VBM, vote by mail states, the rate is about 3.5%. So there is some improvement of the system, some efficiency and some care that goes in as states get to this kind of critical threshold where they're forced to deal with the mail voting system and to develop protocols and processes to handle mail ballots. In states like Texas or New York, where there's very little voting by mail and excuses required, there's a lot of sloppiness in the system and a lot of errors made. It's just on a small denominator of ballots. So it tends not to get the same kind of attention. And I would say one of the things that we're noticing in 2020 is that the failings of voting by mail, which were known to election officials in the past, are now becoming aware to a broad swath of the public. This is a little like what happened in the 2000 presidential election. You remember that election was unsettled because there were disputes about the counting of votes in Florida. That dispute went on for over a month until the Supreme Court intervened, and eventually George Bush was declared the victor because he won Florida and won the majority of the national electoral votes. But one of the issues in Florida was that the design of the ballot in places like Palm Beach County was so poor that it caused voters to make mistakes. There were voters who intended to vote for Al Gore in Palm Beach, but because the layout of the ballot was confusing, mistakenly voted for Pat Buchanan, who was a conservative minor party candidate that year. That was one prominent kind of mistake, but there were things like that happening all over Florida that were never major issues because Florida was not the place where the electoral vote was going to be decided, and it hadn't reached that level of scrutiny. But suddenly in 2000, the scrutiny is so great that Florida and the rest of the country are forced to deal with things like punch card voting machines in the design of ballots, which were very problematic and fortunately have been really remedied in a dramatic way since then. I think one of the stories coming out of 2020 will be all of the imperfections of the voting by mail or absentee voting systems that are being revealed to the public. Because of the larger volume of people who are involved, we're hearing more stories about voters having difficulty, and because of the stress it's putting on the system to have such a dramatic increase in voting by mail. It will be maybe the percentages will not differ this much, but the number of voters who are negatively affected in some way by the mail voting system is sure to be greater this year. So let's talk about the Postal Service. It's been in the news lately, mostly for not good reasons, including a story just yesterday or today where President Trump made some comments about not wanting to fund the Postal Service, in part because it would support all mail voting regimes, I think, as he called them. These are just a couple of the stories that have come out in the last few months about the financial straits in which the Postal Service finds itself. Postal Service has been struggling for a number of years, really since the late 90s or early 2000s, when some new mandates got placed on the Postal Service that it had to fund all of its pensions for all of its employees fully, even before those employees were retired. That was a really unusual requirement that put it in serious financial straits, and it has been limping along. Its life complicated by Amazon and other package delivery services that it has relationships with, and now really being beleaguered, I think, as a political issue in this election because it's so tied up in the voting system. This, I think, also is a surprising thing for a lot of voters, just how central the United States Postal Service is to running a successful election during a pandemic. We are relying on a third party, on the Postal Service, to make the election work properly. The Postal Service is designed to deliver mail, that is for sure, but it is not designed to run an election. But suddenly the Postal Service is confronting issues that are very important on the election administration side of things that it had not confronted so much in the past. For example, the issue of postmarks. Some states require election mail, ballots in particular, to be postmarked by a certain date. Not all mail is postmarked. By policy, not all metered mail in particular is postmarked. Much election mail is metered, and so not all that mail receives a postmark. What is an election official supposed to do when they're told that the ballot needs to be postmarked by the day before the election? The ballot arrives in their inbox with no postmark at all, or a postmark that's unreadable. Delivery times for the Postal Service are somewhat unpredictable and have been lengthening and may be lengthening more this fall because of some new decisions being made there by the new Postmaster General, but also because of budget constraints and maybe because of an increased volume of election-related mail going into October and November. So, you know, the fate of elections that rely on the mail really depends on the fate of the United States Postal Service. The two are inextricable, and it's something to pay attention to. So that's the Postal Service. It's an issue we can talk more about if you'd like. So what do Americans think about voting by mail now that it's become so prominent and so popular? There are surveys now asking the public how they are likely to vote in the fall. Would they prefer to vote in person or by mail? This is a recent survey from YouGov and Yahoo News asking a representative sample of Americans, would they rather vote by mail or by person? It's about a 50-50 split among the whole adult public. Among registered voters, it's a similar mix, but you'll see that there are real differences across groups. Among Democrats, about 2/3 are saying that they would prefer to vote by mail. But among Republicans, about 3/4 are saying they would prefer to vote in person. Why is there a partisan split? Some of it is surely that Republicans and Democrats are responding to rhetoric from President Trump, who has assailed voting by mail or absentee voting, whatever phrase is used, as being fraudulent, that it's an opportunity for voting crimes to be committed and that we ought to be voting in person. And I think Republicans have taken up that message and have become much more interested in voting in person. And Democrats are really sticking to the desire to vote by mail. And there's I think quite a uniform message from Democratic leaders about the encouragement to vote by mail. But it's also a difference in the lives that Democrats and Republicans live. Democrats tend to be in urban areas that are more densely populated. They tend to, on principle, be more cautious about the pandemic. They tell us in surveys they are more likely to wear masks. They are less likely to leave home. They're more likely to work at home. In some cases, they're more likely to have the luxury to work at home. And so voting by mail is just part of a set of precautions that Democrats are more likely to take. Republicans, in contrast, tend to be more likely to live in suburbs, the margins of cities, in exurbs, or in rural areas where the pandemic is less immediately visible and where there's a less dense population. And so fewer precautions are taking place. So some of the partisan difference I think you're seeing in the desire to vote by mail is simply about the lifestyles that people live. And some of it is cheerleading for their partisan side. But even among Democrats, you'll notice that there is some difference between them based on race or ethnicity. White Democrats, at least for now, appear to be more interested in voting by mail. Black and Hispanic Democrats still more inclined to vote in person. And this reflects a real historical tendency that existed before the pandemic of minority voters feeling more confident or maybe prouder to cast their ballot in person. Black Democrats in particular have been inclined to vote early in person. I think it's a sense of pride in having the right to vote and exercising it after so many years of discrimination at the ballot box, but also some distrust of the mail service or others who might be third parties helping to make voting by mail happen. And there's just a kind of surety that comes along with voting in person. That may be changing this year, but right now there still is a racial divide. And you'll see at the bottom of the figure, there's also a difference based on the kind of election regime in which a person lives. For people who live in states like Washington and Oregon, where voting is, or at least ballots are distributed all by mail, about 3/4 say they plan to vote by mail, of course. And that's actually a higher rate than would have done it in the past because so many voters, even in those states, opted to drive those ballots in or bring them in on election day. And the percentages tend to decline as you move from states that are all mail to the majority of states like mine that allow people to vote absentee without an excuse. About half of voters in those states want to vote by mail. And then you get to the Texas and New York cases where an excuse is required. Even there, about 40% of the public is saying they would prefer to vote by mail. It's just challenging or maybe impossible to do given the state laws. Now, here's one other issue you may have heard about that I want you to alert you to as we head into the November election. Because ballots are coming in more by mail, because the Postal Service and voting systems are stressed by the sheer volume of mail ballots, they are taking longer to finalize the tabulation of votes. You saw that in the California primary where it took many weeks to conclude. Just in New York, it took, I think, 4 to 5 weeks for the vote to be concluded. There are other states that have not finished tabulating their votes. It's taking a very long time. And that's consequential in part because the votes that are counted later at the tail end of that process, the votes that happen in overtime, if you will, are more likely to be Democratic votes, whereas the votes that are tabulated immediately on election day or soon after tend to be more Republican. That's not a universal pattern, but it's been one that has developed over time. That's what this figure shows. In elections from the 1940s until up through 2016, votes that were cast in overtime, that were counted in overtime, they were tabulated after election day, were more likely to be blue votes than red votes. And you can see that starting around 2000 or 2004, there begins to be a divide among the states or an imbalance among the states, so that the late counted votes are more likely to be Democratic. It's not a huge margin. It's today about 0.5% more Democratic in those late ballots than the early ones. Whereas prior to 2000, some states' late ballots would be more likely to be Democratic, but others would be more likely to be Republican. That might have actually been the more dominant tendency. But since about 2000, things have shifted. Why have things shifted? I think there are two reasons. One is the kinds of people who are Republicans and Democrats have changed over time. Beginning in the 2000s, we started to see a massive age gap or generation gap in the preferences of voters, where older voters were more likely to be Republican, younger voters more likely to be Democratic. Older voters are more likely to get those ballots in early and to do it without problem. They are experienced voters who have a lot of resources, and those ballots tend to be counted pretty easily and pretty quickly. Younger voters have less experience. They face more challenges because they're often voting for the first time, so it's a new experience. They move more often, and so their registration is often out of date or needs to be updated. They're less likely to have reliable signatures that can be easily verified, and they tend to make mistakes. And so you get more what are called provisional ballots and other kinds of absentee and straggler ballots that get counted later, and that skews more Democratic. The other thing that happened in 2000 after the debacle in Florida was that the federal government passed something called the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, signed into law by George Bush. And that law mandated that every state offer provisional ballots. These are ballots for voters who come into a polling place, find that they're not listed in the voter registration, or there's some dispute about their identity or their eligibility. They are given a provisional ballot, which is put in a separate pile and is not tabulated unless the voter comes back that day or within the week, typically, to validate their ballot, either by bringing in an ID or proof of registration or something else. Voters who are in that box of getting a provisional ballot tend to be younger, lower income, more urban, more residentially mobile, and so more Democratic. And those ballots are less likely to be counted, and if they are counted at the end of the process. So I think both for demographic reasons and for changes in the law, we're starting to see what is called the blue shift after Election Day. This is a real concern because not only are we less likely to know the result on election night, but it is likely to move in a blue direction as the days go on. Those of you who were in California 2 years ago in the 2018 midterm elections will remember how long it took to decide a number of those congressional elections, particularly in Orange County, and that those seats tended to flip Democratic, as including seats like Katie Porter's, flipping Democratic as late arriving ballots were included. So this is something to be aware of. Not only will there be a longer counting period, but it's likely to advantage the Democrats in terms of where the ballots go after Election Day. So this is the big blue shift. Keep it in mind. We should expect to see it this year, just as we have over the last few election cycles. Another concern this year are our poll workers. Part of the mess in Wisconsin that you may have seen on the news back in April is that there were long lines. There were long lines because most of the poll workers, particularly in bigger urban areas, backed out of their obligations to serve as poll workers, including a lot of veteran poll workers who had served for many years. They simply didn't feel safe being at the polling place. That is because so many of the poll workers are older. This is again from this is from 2018, but it'd be a similar pattern from 2016. The majority of poll workers in the United States are over age 60, which makes sense. They are retired, they have the time, they often have the interest and resources and experience, and they want to serve, and we really value them. But because they are at greater risk during the pandemic, they have largely backed out of serving. And that has put real pressure on the system to find replacement poll workers. I'm going to say something more about that in a moment, but I just want to alert you to this fact. We cannot get rid of Election Day polling places overnight. In states that have done that, places like Oregon, it has taken place over many years. And the lines that we saw in Wisconsin and Georgia and other places were the result of reductions or consolidations in polling places. Let me show you one example of that. This is the map of the city of Milwaukee. That's the shaded area. The larger white area is the county of Milwaukee. Each one of the dots you see is a polling place. On the left-hand side are polling places in the 2016 presidential primaries, 4 years ago. On the right-hand side are polling places in the 2020 primary back in April. Blue dots indicate precincts or wards that were predominantly Democratic. Red dots indicate ones that were predominantly Republican. You can see the city is more Democratic, the outlying area is more Republican, not so surprising. What is completely shocking is that Milwaukee went from 180 polling places in the city, those are the blue dots on the left, to 5 polling places in the city in 2020. That created massive lines and surely deterred some people from going to vote on election day. We need to maintain traditional neighborhood polling places, in my view, in the short run, because voters who attempt to use the mail voting system, but for whom it doesn't work because the ballot isn't delivered on time or they make an error when they're marking the ballot, they need election day as a fail-safe. We used to think of voting by mail as the fail-safe for people who couldn't vote on election day. It's now the reverse. Many people turning to vote by mail, but election day is going to be the saving grace for many of them. So fortunately, Milwaukee is remedying this, and just in the primary this week, there were something like 160 or 170 polling places, but the reductions were really dramatic and did have a lot of negative effects on the election back in April. So what do we do going forward? I'm going to suggest just some solutions for us to think about. These are some things that can be done now in the days leading up to the November election. Others are probably a little further down the road, but I think all ought to be considered. First of all, anyone who receives a ballot by mail, in my view, ought to have the postage paid. Obviously, the mail should be sent to them by the election official with postage attached, but the return envelope to send the ballot back should also be prepaid with metered mail or a stamp. Otherwise, you're imposing essentially a poll tax requiring a person to pay an expense to mail a ballot back and to find stamps during a pandemic. So you're requiring them probably to go outside the house in order to get the postage and affix it to the envelope. That is obviously an additional cost, but also a delay is going to hold up the voting process. So postage paid is an easy one, I think. It does cost states something at a time when their budgets are constrained, but states have shown they can do it. Ironically, during a pandemic, I would argue that we ought to have more voting locations, not fewer. Milwaukee tried to have fewer voting locations out of necessity due to a lack of poll workers, but their argument was that it was acceptable because they were moving to large locations. They were moving to gymnasiums and auditoriums and places where lots of people could be present and where there could be spacing. That was somewhat helpful, but not sufficient. Absolutely not sufficient. There is a limit to how many voting stations can exist, to how many poll books can be distributed. In some cities, they are talking about using NBA arenas for voting and having these kind of massive voting stations. I think that's fine, but it should augment local polling places, not replace them. There are transportation issues for people in urban areas. Even if the arena is comfortable and has lots of space, it is some distance from their home, whereas a neighborhood polling place can usually be walked to. So let's keep those polling places. That means we're going to need as many poll workers as before and maybe more. And this is very challenging because so many people don't want to serve as poll workers. It means that election officials will have to get creative about recruiting people to serve. In Wisconsin, the National Guard has been used to supplement existing volunteer poll workers. The members of the Guard have served in plain clothes voluntarily, so voters don't know who's in the National Guard and who is just one of their neighbors volunteering to be a poll worker. That has worked very well. The National Guard members report really positive experiences. Voters say they have been served well, and so that's something to think about. In my city of Madison, the city clerk ended up recruiting bartenders to serve as poll workers because at the height of the pandemic, the bartenders were out of work. They were looking for something to do. Poll workers do get paid, and the city clerk not only is in charge of elections, she also licenses bartenders. So she had a full list of who they were and could easily contact them. So there are some, I think, clever things like that that could be done. Recruiting students or other populations is one thing to think about. Returning ballots by mail is fine, but I have highlighted a number of real concerns with the mail system, and particularly for voters who find themselves up against the deadline of the postmark date or the delivery date, they will need other ways to return ballots. Several states out west have already figured this out by offering drop boxes on public streets. These look like Postal Service boxes, but instead of being blue, they're colored in a way to indicate that they're for ballots. They are monitored, they're locked. Some of them have cameras on them 24 hours a day, so security is not really a problem. Drive-up voting is another option that has been used in places like Colorado, where people can simply pull up and stick the ballot out the window and hand it off to an election worker. There's no worry about the ballot not being delivered in those instances. Some cities have even experimented with using library return slots for books as a place for ballots to be returned. I think in the pandemic, at least, we have to rethink the rules for voter signatures, for the signatures of witnesses or notaries in some cases, and the deadlines for getting ballots postmarked or returned. Those things are all just very challenging in a time when people are physically distancing from one another, when the mail service may be slower, when people's lives are disrupted. Those kinds of rules become much more problematic and affect many more people because of the number of people voting by mail. Some states, especially those that do a lot of voting by mail, use what are called intelligent mail barcodes, or IMBs, which are codes on the outside of the envelope that allow for the mail to be scanned as it's put into the mail stream and tracked, just the way a person would track a package from UPS or FedEx. The mail barcode is really helpful for both the voter and the election official, but if it's done right, it can allow either of them to check on the status of that ballot anytime. If you're worried about the ballot not getting to you that you've requested as a voter, you can check and see where it is in the mail stream online, and if you're required to do so, head into a polling place and vote in person. If there's a dispute about whether the ballot was requested or whether it's been issued, the barcodes should remedy that. So it really is a helpful piece of information, and some states are working to implement those. The other difficulty I highlighted at the beginning is that voter registration rates are down, and voter registration is more difficult during the pandemic. Voters are not interacting with campaigns and voter registration drives the way they normally would. They are also not interacting with government agencies like motor vehicles offices, where a lot of voter registration happens. Some states offer voter registration online. In some of those states, however, you have to have a driver's license or other kind of ID card to even use that system. So I think increasing the accessibility of the voter registration system is really important. And then finally, for all of us as voters, as consumers, and also for campaigns and journalists, we have to change our expectations about what we will know on election night and what it means. This lesson came to us somewhat in the 2018 elections, but I think it's been forgotten. Many states will not be able to produce even a good rough count on election night. Election night was never a final count, but we often took it as such. People would declare that a candidate had won a state or that a party had won a district or won in the electoral college. That's going to be much more uncertain this time around because there will be a larger number of ballots that are not yet tabulated on election night. And because of the blue shift that I highlighted before, the later ballots that are counted in the days after the election are more likely to be Democratic. So there's a partisan consequence of this as well. So I think we have to resist jumping to conclusions on election night and to be patient and waiting for those to come in. It is frustrating after a campaign that feels like it's been running for 2 years and with all the other frustrations that accompany the pandemic. But I think it really does, I think it really is a necessity if the election is going to function properly. We can talk more about that, but I think it's an important thing for you all to take away and share with your friends and family. Election night is just going to be different and not have the finality that it normally would. So that's the talk. If you enjoy this kind of analysis and you want to keep up with the sort of research that my center has been doing, we are in the midst of all the debates and analysis about voting by mail for sure. We're also doing surveys of voters in 3 key battleground states in the Midwest: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We just had surveys released this past week. We're doing a variety of analyses. You can keep up with us by visiting our website, which is there, or following the center on Twitter or Facebook. All right, so that's the talk on voting in a pandemic. Thanks for sticking with me. I've been hearing during the talk lots of questions coming up in the chat, so I'm going to head to those. I need to make sure I'm not sharing my screen anymore. Can somebody verify you're seeing me and not the slides?
Yes, you're good.
Great. All right, loads of questions in the chat. We have a limited amount of time. Let's pick out a few here that look like they are common questions to multiple people. Yeah, let's talk about vote security. I see a couple of questions about the integrity of the vote and making sure that we're protecting against hacking and that kind of thing. You know, before the pandemic hit, we thought that the two major concerns this year would be influence by foreign actors through disinformation or misinformation, particularly on social media, or efforts by those actors to try to disrupt or add confusion or maybe even hack an election result. The intelligence community has documented efforts, particularly by Russian actors sponsored by the Russian government in 2016. Those concerns have sort of been pushed aside because of, naturally, the focus on the pandemic, but they are still there. And this year, there are a wider set of actors who are involved, more countries and more non-state actors. The good news is that the intelligence community has done a tremendous amount of work over the last 3.5 years to shore up election systems. The Department of Homeland Security has been tremendous, working with states to implement things like Albert sensors in the systems to track malicious activity, implementing logs to keep track of any changes made to a voter registration database that can then be unraveled if there's any concern about, you know, improper activity, duplication and redundancy in systems, and a variety of additional safeguards. So, you know, the system is not perfectly secure. It's a big, complicated network of things. There's no national system. It's 50 state systems, and even the 50 states push down a lot of responsibilities to counties or municipalities. So there are, unfortunately, a lot of points of entry. So that provides opportunities for people doing bad stuff. The good news about that is that anyone who infiltrates one county or one municipality is unlikely to affect the nationwide election system. So that there is a little bit of security built into that decentralization, kind of by accident. But there are, you know, simpler things that someone can do to create confusion or disinformation. Hacking a website of an election official to alter the results that are being posted on a website is much easier to do than trying to get into the election system itself. So that is a concern. If anything, voting by mail probably improves security over people voting on electronic machines in person. It means that there is a paper trail for every ballot that is received by an election official, so there can be a hand count or an audit afterwards if there are any concerns about what, you know, how the electronic machines have done the tabulation. As I showed earlier in the talk, about 3/4 of voters in the US this fall will be able to vote by mail, and something like 90% of voters will be voting on paper. So those are real improvements over 4 years ago. So the security problems are never solved, but I think we're in a much better place than we were 3 years ago. It's just become a much harder task to run an election. There's nothing like it. You know, imagine if I asked you to put together on one day every 4 years a national initiative where you would hire 1 million volunteers to serve as one-day poll workers. You would train them all and deploy them. You would distribute machines for voting and put them in places like churches and schools and civic buildings. And you would feel pressure to tabulate all those results and have an outcome on election night. Meanwhile, complying with all federal and state laws, complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act, trying to ward off disinformation, and now handling a crush of absentee and mail ballots that you've never handled before. It is a very different job from 20 or 30 years ago, and requires a real set of professional core of people who are trained and have the right attitude to do this sort of thing. Let's see, other questions. Oh, so many good questions. I'm not going to get to all of them. Sorry that we're not going to get through all of them, but I want to pick out a few that look like they're common. Yeah, so here's a question. Has any analysis been done regarding whose ballots are rejected? So is there, some inadvertent discrimination or intentional vote suppression happening with ballots that are being rejected? There has been research on this, particularly in California and Florida, where there's good information about the people or places where ballots are rejected. The most common patterns are that young voters have their ballots rejected at much higher rates for reasons I talked about before: their lack of experience with the voting system, lack of a reliable signature, the frequent moving. Sometimes the registration is out of date and doesn't line up with the registration on file. So there are lots of reasons why young people's ballots are more likely to be uncounted. In some states, there's evidence that voters of color, Black and Hispanic voters, and Asian voters are less likely to have their ballots counted than non-Hispanic whites. That pattern doesn't show up everywhere, but it does appear in some places. And I've never seen the reverse pattern, where white voters' ballots are counted more. Sometimes that's due to a language issue where ballots are not distributed or issued in the primary language that a person speaks or writes at home. Other times it's, I think, lack of experience with the voting system. Other times it's that non-white voters are concentrated in parts of the city that have less good election infrastructure. I think there are a variety of reasons why that sometimes happens. First-generation immigrants also less likely to have their ballots counted. And voters who are overseas because of the military or because of jobs or other reasons they're out of the country, those ballots are much less likely to be counted. They're very hard to get back by the deadline, and mistakes are commonly made when someone's sending the ballot back from a vacation in France or from a submarine in the Atlantic Ocean. There are just lots of reasons why that happens. So I don't think it's bias exactly and not intentional, but the systems have also not been improved to try to remedy some of the disparities we see between different groups' counting rates. Let's see, other questions. Yeah, there is a question on Democrats wanting to vote more by mail this year, Republicans to wanting to vote more in person. The chart shows the breakdown of white, Black, and Hispanic Democrats and some of the racial and ethnic differences I talked about. Why does the breakout not exist for Republicans? The short answer is there aren't enough Black or Hispanic Republicans in most surveys to do any kind of analysis like that. African Americans identify with Democrats about 90% of the time and certainly vote with Democrats about 90% of the time. So in a national survey of 1,000 people or even a couple thousand people, there just aren't enough Black Republicans to study. Hispanics are not quite that lopsided in their partisan preferences, but are likely to be voting Democratic at a rate of, say, somewhere around 70% this year. So there are also not a lot of Hispanic respondents to analyze. I think it would be an interesting question, I think, to see whether the racial pattern exists in the same way on the Republican side as it does the Democratic, but we just don't know because of there being so few of those. How about a question about voter turnout? Does voting by mail increase voter turnout? Or I would say more generally, does the option to vote absentee or maybe living in a state that has a vote at home system like Oregon increase turnout? I think there's a pre-COVID answer to this and a COVID or post-COVID answer. The pre-COVID answer is that absentee voting and vote by mail seem to have no effect on improving voter turnout. And in addition, voting by absentee, when that option is allowed in a state, or even when early voting in person is allowed, there's evidence that turnout goes down. Some of my research and that of some other colleagues around the country have shown that it's a traditional election day face-to-face interaction that stimulates a lot of voters who are on the cusp of voting or not voting to turn out. There's a kind of social pressure that happens by going to a polling place and seeing your neighbors. There's also a lot of information and underwriting of the cost of voting that happens when there's a single election day. And when you essentially privatize voting and make it invisible by having people get ballots in their mailbox, complete them in the privacy of their own home, and then mail them back, you're taking away a lot of the visibility and stimulation that goes along with election day. Now, vote by mail is a little different because in states that do all of the ballots by mail, there are voters who maybe weren't thinking ahead of time to request a ballot, but it shows up in their mailbox, and that can be a helpful reminder. So in those states, we don't see a decline in turnout as a result of vote by mail existing, but there's no increase, at least not in presidential elections. There is some evidence that vote by mail in Oregon helps turnout in special elections or primaries or others where turnout would be very low. But the fact that people get a ballot in the mail automatically means that they will go ahead and participate. So that's the pre-COVID answer. And by the way, those studies also show that there's no real partisan advantage, and certainly not a Democratic advantage, which is what's being alleged in part this year. So it's a fine option, really in the past for voters who were going to vote anyway, but now are provided with an option to vote by mail pretty easily. Now, during COVID, things have changed. Because there's been such a massive and dramatic turn towards voting by mail, and so many people are trapped at home, we've seen pretty good turnout rates in the states that have held primaries this year with high levels of voting by mail. And I think it's a different kind of person who's voting by mail this year, and for different reasons. And more states are being aggressive about, like California, distributing all ballots by mail when they were not doing it in the past, or sending voters applications to vote by mail in places like Michigan and Wisconsin. So there's more information reaching voters, and I think more of an awareness of voting by mail, and that seems to be going along with higher turnout rates. I'm not sure that we can say one is causing the other. That'll have to wait for more research, but the two seem to be connected. I also don't think there's a partisan advantage to more voting by mail this year. It is true that Democrats are more likely to use the vote by mail option, and Republicans are more likely to say or to actually vote in person rather than by mail. But that's different from saying that offering voting by mail or increasing voting by mail will help one party disproportionately, that it will bring out more Democratic voters. That has been, there's been a partisan tendency this year, but that's, I think, reflecting, as I mentioned before, the lifestyles that Democrats and Republicans live and their kind of response to the rhetoric they're hearing from President Trump about voting by mail. It may come to bite Republicans to some degree this year if they are offering mixed messages about voting by mail. Trump has been very down on it, but Republican leaders in the states, Republican parties in many states have been sending out absentee ballot applications to their voters and encouraging their supporters to vote by mail. So I think the mixed message is going to be a little complicated. The party that's advantaged by voting by mail or any other process is the one that takes advantage of it. A party that really invests in a particular way of voting and gets information to voters and supports them with resources and information and assistance is going to benefit. And right now the Democrats are investing a little more on that side. But I think that's a little different from saying that there's a partisan effect naturally. I think that's a combination of the pandemic, responses to Trump, and everything else that's swirling around this year. So that's a long answer, but I think there really is a difference this year. And I think it will be important for us to watch and learn to see whether the patterns that get established in 2020 persist into 2022 and to the next presidential election in 2024, or whether voters and parties and others end up reverting back to old ways of doing things after the pandemic passes. Here's a great question. Do I have a concern that the time it takes to certify winners may run up against constitutional timelines? This will be the last question I answer because I know some of you need to go. Yes. One of my concerns about states delaying their primaries in the spring, like so many of them did, was that it was setting a precedent for potentially changing the date of the November election. The date of the November election cannot be changed, certainly not by the president unilaterally. It is set by federal law and has been there since the late 1800s. The date is important. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, November 3rd this year, because the Electoral College meets about 5 weeks later on December 14th. That's when electors meet simultaneously in all state capitals. So the 55 electors from California will meet in Sacramento, and in my state, the 10 electors will meet in Madison at noon and cast their electoral votes in most states based on who won the popular vote. Those electoral votes then need to be transmitted to Washington. They are opened by the president of the Senate, who's the vice president of the United States, that's Mike Pence, and counted in front of the new Congress, and that's where the That's where the decision is made about whether someone has won a majority of the electoral vote. When the Florida debacle happened 20 years ago, we were running into those deadlines because it had been over a month since the popular vote had been cast. And the Florida electoral vote needed to be decided because it was coming up just a few days actually after the Bush v. Gore decision was made. On the day that Bush v. Gore was decided, that evening, earlier in the day, the Florida legislature had started to go ahead and appoint its own electors, ignoring the popular vote or sort of separate from the popular vote. Republicans controlled the state legislature in Florida, also the governorship, and so they were inclined to appoint Republican electors, regardless of what was happening with the counts in Florida. And they have the right to do that. The Constitution gives every state legislature the right to appoint its electors. Most states have decided to follow the popular vote. But there may be some incentive or motivation this year for some state legislatures to jump ahead of the popular vote if they feel like it's not going to be certified in time, or they don't trust it, or it has been undermined in some way, maybe rhetorically, to go ahead and appoint electors. We're not in constitutional crisis at that point, but we begin to get near it. Imagine a worst case scenario, and these are some of the things that my colleagues and I are thinking about. A state is counting ballots for weeks after election day, maybe a swing state like Wisconsin or Arizona or Pennsylvania. We get near the electoral college vote. Things are not totally certain, or maybe there's dispute about the results. Maybe the legislature in the state says, we're going to ignore those results and go ahead and appoint electors that are consistent with our party. The governor of the state may be of a different party, and it's actually the governor that signs the certificates that go to Washington. It's possible that a state could send two sets of electors, two sets of certificates to Washington, one coming from the legislature, one coming from the governor. Then what does the vice president do when opening those? Which set will be counted? This may sound crazy, but it happened with some frequency in the 1800s. There were disputes about who had won a state and who had the right to get that state's electors. It happened as late as the 1960s, I think, in the state of Hawaii. And again, almost happened in Florida in 2000, where the legislature was trying to jump the process, but Bush v. Gore ended it and decided in a similar fashion. So I really do worry about running against those deadlines. They could be changed. There's no need for the Electoral College to vote in mid-December. That's really a relic of the 1800s when transportation and communication took so much longer. And so there needed to be time for people to get to the state capitals and then time for the votes to be transmitted to Washington for counting. There's actually a bill in the Senate sponsored by Senator Marco Rubio that would push back the Electoral College vote to the beginning of January, which I think is a great idea. It takes the pressure off getting that vote done immediately and getting it done right, and lets us, do it correctly rather than do it quickly. So that's a great question to ask about. Okay, I think we're nearing our end, and you've all been very patient to stick with me, so I really do appreciate that. I think I'm going to stop taking questions here and hand it back over to Sarah and our hosts.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Professor Burton. So we are going to be looking to post this online for people who were asking about that. But we'll let people know about that at a later time. Greg, do you have anything?
Just thank you again, Professor Burton. That was wonderful, very informative.
Thanks for having me.